Let's conclude our Appwrite tutorial by exploring Appwrite functions. So Appwrite functions are user-defined functions that can start small and scale big, deploying automatically from a source control. This function can be triggered by an HTTP request, SDK methods, server events, webhooks, and also scheduled execution. And each function will have its own URL, execute in its own isolated container, and will have its own configurable environment variables and permissions. So let's get started. So for a quick start in here, we need to first of all create a function. So before deploying your function with Git, you need to create a function attached to your Git repository, right? And in your Appwrite console sidebar, click on functions, click on create functions. Under the connect Git repository, you can select a provider. After connecting to GitHub, under quick start, you can start with the starter template. The next step is to follow the step-by-step wizard and create a function. So let's do that. So in our Appwrite console, the sidebar over here, we search for functions and we need to create a new function over here. So we can connect our GitHub. So I can connect my GitHub to have access to all repositories in here. So once I'm connected with GitHub, you can see my repos are pulled over here, and you can see I just made one trial with Node.js 2 days ago. And for a quick start, we need to choose one of these server to work on: the Node.js, the Python, Dino, PHP, Go, right? So I'll go with Node.js in here, and by default, this is how the name is going to be: starter function. And you select the version of the runtime, which I'm going to leave it as Node.js 22, and hit on the next button. And we allow anyone to execute and also anyone to read information, so you can proceed from here. Deployment, so connect with your Git recommended, or you need to create a new repository over here. So you can clone to a template to a newly created repository in your organization. So I'll go with that one and hit on the next button. And this will create, the repository name is going to be a starter, right? So I already have one repository created known as starter. So this is going to be starter 2. And I can keep it private as well and click on the next button. So you leave everything as default. The root is going to be default, and click on create in here. And there you go, you have your function create. So once you create a function, you can see the status is processing, then you move to building. So at the building stage, it will build. There you go, you can see function is active, right? So this is the domain you can view, right? So let's move ahead and create our first function. And the first step to do in here is to clone the repository, the Appwrite created in your repos. So let's do that. So in my repository, you can see our starter project in here, starter 2, created by the Appwrite team, and it has everything in it. So I'll click on the code over here and copy that. So I'll bring in my terminal over here and change the directory to be my desktop, and I'll clone this project on my desktop. So git clone, then I'll paste in the link. There you go. So once we have successful cloning of the project, you can see when you list it, you can see our starter 2 project, which is found on the desktop. So I'll drag this project on VS Code and authorize that. So this is basically the project, and in the source you can see our main.js file, and the first function in here is they try to initialize a client by setting an endpoint, setting a project, and it is set a project key as well, and get users in here and try to list the users. And finally, they return response.json and pass in all this. So to actually see this in working, right? To actually see this working, let's visit the domain of the function we created. So we have domain over here, and once we hit this domain, make a get request with this information, and this information is basically this one. Yeah, so over here, let's start by creating our own user-defined functions, right? So I'll get rid of this sample code over here and start to create our own, right? So our example is going to be logout, right? So logging the user out from with a function method. So over here, we already have our users from the Node Appwrite, and when we check within our package.json file under the dependency, we already have the Node Appwrite as part of our dependency. So in this try block over here, we already have our users in here passing the clients. So in this try block, we can check for the request method, right? So the request is coming from the function with the structure and getting the request over here. We check for the request method if it's equal to the post request, and at the same time also check for the request path. So we need to pass in the request path, which is going to be request.path. So we check for the path if that's equal to /logout. So if indeed this is true, we proceed logging the user out. And before we do that, we need to get a user ID and also the session ID, right? So we can get out from the request body using request.body.user ID. We can access the user ID, right? Since it's going to be a post request, you are definitely going to get some information passing. So we pass our user ID. We need to get our session ID over here as well. That's going to be request.body.session ID. So once we have this, we check to make sure our user ID and also the session ID is available. So if there isn't any user ID or if there isn't any session ID, right, we can return response.json with a message and also the status, right? So the success state is going to be false. And also we pass in a message over here. And the message over here is going to be user ID and also the session ID is required. Yeah, there we go. So if you don't have any of these, we can just return a message. And if we have the user ID and also the session ID, we can proceed to log the user out. So we await, since this is an asynchronous function, we await and call our users variable, and we can call the delete session method on it, right? So users.delete sessions, and in this delete sessions we need to pass in the user ID, and I think you need to pass in the session ID. Yeah, the user ID and also the session ID. Yeah, so if we have successful deletion of the session of the user, we can return a JSON with the success state to be true and also the message in here to be user is logged out. Yeah, and I think that's a pretty much simple function to work around. So if you have any error, you can just use the error method to log out the error. So I'll change in the error message over here to be logout failed. Yeah, so basically what we're doing here, let's log the user, right? I'll show you where to find this log in our console. Yeah, so let me explain over here. So basically what we're doing is checking for the request method if that's equal to a post request and a path is equal to /logout. We get in the user ID and the session ID, check if they exist. If they don't exist, we return this. If they exist, we try and delete the user session with the user ID and the session ID, then finally return a JSON with the state and also the message. So let's try and push this to GitHub, and Appwrite will take that and build a new and deploy a new one for us, right? So I need to make a configuration over here. Let me do that real quick. Yeah, so I'll add that and also make a commit again. I think I already made a commit. Let's see. Yeah, so I need to push this update. So the git push, and that will push the update. So when we visit our console, we should have a new deployment building over here. And here we check and see the status is building, and there we go, it's active, right? So we can check the executions over here. You can see we made 3 executions, and the method in here is going to be. Yeah, so in our Flutter app, let's bring in our functions, right? So we're going to have functions, then we're going to name it as functions. Then we can pass our client to the functions. Yeah, so once we have our functions here, you can pass that to my app and also require that in the constructor of my app. Then we can finally create our function. So my app now has access to the function. You can pass that down to the home widget, which we are going to use it over there, and we can require that in the constructor of my home page over here. Then you can do same thing by bringing in the functions. There you go. So we'll be adding functionality to the logout method. So we search where we are logging the user out, the functionality. Yeah, there it is. So we'll try to log the user out by calling a function. So I'll comment this out. And this function is going to be, so first of all, I'll bring in my try, and let's try and get the user. So I'll be creating the user variable to hold the user. So to get the user, you can make use of the account. And that's going to be widget.account.get, and this will get you the user. And also let's bring in our session ID. So I'll be creating a variable of sessions, and that's going to be, we're going to await and call our widget.account, then we list all the sessions in for this particular user. Yeah, so once we have access to the user and the sessions, we can try and execute the function by calling the await. Then we can call our widget.functions. Then we can create an execution. So widget.function.create execution, and this expects the function ID. So I'll get a function ID over here. I'll grab this function ID. Yeah, so once you have the function ID, I'll place this function ID in our app configuration. So I'll add that and rename this to be the function ID. So within our create execution method, you need to pass in by calling the appconfig.function ID. And also we can also pass in the path as well. The path is going to be /logout. So let's handle the exception over here. So it's going to be on Appwrite exception. Then we can catch any exception in here. So in here we are basically going to print the exception. Yeah, so there are more things to add to this create execution, right? So it is in the method, and the method in here is going to be a post method. So execution method.post. So execution method.post. There we go. Then we check whether it's asynchronous as well. Then we pass in the value of true, it's asynchronous. Then we finally pass in the body. So the body here is going to be the user ID and also the session ID. So it's going to be JSON encode that is in the object. So in here we are going to have our users user ID, where we can pass in, we can make reference to our user and access the ID. Same thing happens to the sessions. So with the sessions over here, it's going to be the session ID. Then we can call the sessions.sessions. We list the available sessions and we pick the first one and have access to the ID. So we pass in the user ID and the session ID. Then we pass in the headers in here. So the header is going to be application/JSON. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So I will do that in here. So we'll pass in the user ID and the session ID. Then we pass in the headers in here. So the header is going to be application/JSON. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So I will do that in here. So we'll pass in the user ID and the session ID. Then we pass in the headers in here. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So I will do that in here. So we'll pass in the user ID and the session ID. Then we pass in the headers in here. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So I will do that in here. So we'll pass in the user ID and the session ID. Then we pass in the headers in here. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So the content type is going to be application/JSON. So I will do that in here. So we'll pass in the user ID and the session ID. Then we pass in the headers in here. So the content type So content type is going to be application / JSON. Yeah, and that's basically it. So we make use of the function, create a new execution, pass in the function ID, path, the method which is going to be the post asynchronous as well. Then we pass in the body and pass in the headers, which is going to be application / JSON. So let's give it a try over here. Yeah, so over here I'll try and register a new user with the email, password, and also the name. So I'll go with the email over here as gmail.com. Yeah, so I'll proceed to give my password over here and finally my name and register a new user. There we go. You can see our user is being registered with logged in as. So let's add functionality to log the user out. And before we do that, let's first of all update the logged in user. So I'll grab this code snippet in here, and after successful execution of the function, I'll update the state of the logged in user to be null over here and saving the changes. So once the changes is saved, we can log the user out over here. So when I click on the log out, there we go, we can see the state is changed. So when we visit our executions over here, it's indeed failed over here in making a post request. And when we view the logs, you can see logout failed. And cloud.appwrite, the scope is easiest.write. It doesn't have access to write, right? So let's fix that. I realized we need to create a new server API key. So overview session over here, API keys. I've created one here, so we need to create a new one. And once you have the new one, you need to give it the permission scope. So you come to the sessions. Yeah, so this is the permission scope over here, and you can just choose functions only. So I give the permission scope to be the auth, database, function, storage, and also messaging, and update that. So once you have that update, you can set a key over here to be process.env.secret key. So I place it in the settings, right? So down below over here, when you check the settings, the global variables, I just add one new thing, that's the secret key, then passing the newly created API key. So when we are trying to access it, to automatically pick it from the console, right? So once we have this in place, we can update our function in here by giving it a commit message and also adding the new changes. So once you have that, you can push the new changes in here. Yeah, and when you check the console, you can see our new changes is in the process of building, and once it's ready, to turn to active. There you go, as you can see. So let's give it one more trial. So the first logout failed, so let's try and log the user out again, right? So we already have the user logged in. Let's try and log the user out. There we go. So let's view the console and see the executions. There we go. We have completed one execution. That's the post request. So when we view the logs, the errors, we have nothing, and the logs, I just log the user in here. So that's basically it with the functions of Appwrite with Node.js. See you, and that's the end of the tutorial. Bye bye.